Let me just say this is a question and answer session of the MeCCSA Radio Studies Network Reading Group. And today we're joined by Paula Serafini, who is a research associate at the Research Institute for Cultural and Media Economies at the University of Leicester in the UK, and is also the author of an article we discussed a couple of months ago in the reading group, and which we're going to discuss further now, which is called Community Radio as a Space of Care, an Ecofeminist Perspective on Media Production in Environmental Conflicts, and that was published in the International Journal of Communication in 2019. So we're going to have some questions, but first I'll hand over to Paula just to give a brief talk.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Really, these spaces are very valued at this time where I miss, being with my colleagues and exchanging ideas. So yeah, I'm really glad to be able to join you today. So I thought I'd give a bit of information on what I do in my research and the project that this paper comes out of, just to contextualize it and contextualize the discussion. Perhaps the first thing I should mention is that I'm not a radio scholar. This is the first paper I published on radio, but there was a reason why I chose to publish on this. So my background is more on social movements, art activism, particularly performance, and community media has kind of come into my work in the last couple of years. This particular, well, actually before the project, so my research is quite interdisciplinary because I have an interdisciplinary background. So I studied art history, and then I studied anthropology, and then I did a PhD that was a mix of sociology and art theory. And I think that comes through in the work, and sometimes it's hard to place myself in one discipline, but I would say I'm in the field of cultural politics broadly. And this paper comes out of a project that I did between 2017 and 19, which was looking at the narratives against extractivism in Argentina and the role of art and community media in disseminating those narratives. And by extractivism, I mean this model of production of intensive extraction of natural resources that is characteristic of Argentina and many Latin American countries. And I was looking at this because I realized how invisibilized these issues were. We were seeing, well, I was seeing from Facebook groups and, from very marginalized media production, people denouncing the effects of open pit mining, of fracking, of monocrop agriculture, GMOs, glyphosate, and all these things. But I wasn't seeing any of this in the mainstream media. And actually, when asking my family about it, they didn't know what was going on, a few kilometers away from where they live. So I wanted to kind of visibilize the practices that are actually talking about these things and looking at what kind of frames that were given to these conflicts and what kind of processes lay behind their practices, kind of, I guess, starting from the hypothesis that the kinds of community arts and media that were challenging the extractivist system were not just denouncing, but they were also trying to put forward other ways of living together, other ways of producing that counter. This project is not just, extractivism, it's not just an economic model, but it's also a vision of society. It's based on certain ideas about nature as resource, labor as resource, that go back to colonization of the continent, basically. And that are linked also to kind of gender dynamics, racialized dynamics, etc. So yeah, that was my interest for the project. I got some funding from the British Academy to go do fieldwork, and I visited quite a few different provinces. And this paper actually, it came out, it was interesting how it all came together, because we had a conference at CAMEo Research Institute, where I'm based, in 2018. And the theme for this conference was care and the cultural industries. And it was something that I hadn't thought about before directly, but I was already getting into ideas of ecofeminism. And when the theme came about, it just clicked, and I started looking at these radios in a completely different way. And the paper, I just had the idea, I presented the paper, and then that turned into an article. And it just clicked to look at these radios in this way. So this paper was an attempt at looking at radio in a more, I guess, holistic way, in a contextualist way, in the context of environmental conflicts, particularly in Argentina. Finally, the other thing I wanted to perhaps mention is that I think it's interesting to look at these ideas and to discuss care right now, because this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, has actually exposed a global crisis of care. And in the cultural industries and in cultural industry studies and media studies, we have been talking about care for a few years now. There has been a lot of work published in the last couple of years, but now this has come to the forefront. These discussions have gained more visibility because of the need for care that a lot of cultural workers and producers have, and all of the lacks on behalf of the state, and also because of a matter of visualizing all of the care work that cultural producers do in their work. So yeah, I thought it was a timely discussion to have as well. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Paula. So now we'll open it out to questions. If anyone's got any questions, you can either raise your hand using the raise hand feature in Zoom, or you can, if you're happy for me to ask it on your behalf, you can type it in the chat. But to start with, I feel like I should ask you maybe on behalf, because this is a radio studies group, could you talk a bit more about how you came to community radio as an, you know, because it's not your background. What was particularly about community radio that drew you towards it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it was through the field work, through visiting places and seeing how radio was an important aspect of the work. One of the cases I talk about in this article was Andalgalá, which is this mining town. It's the place where the first open pit mining was established in the country in 1997. So they're kind of a landmark case of resistance, and actually the resistance has been quite strong because they stopped a second mine from being open. And they were talking about the radio and how important it was in instances of repression and of absolute threat. And that's where the idea of the radio as a tool of care in the situation of imminent threat came about. But then I guess the reason I became interested in radio as a medium was in a different location, which was in Neuquén, which is in the south of the country where they have fracking now. And I was introduced to this idea of open radio, which I hadn't encountered before, which I thought was really interesting because it was kind of a mix of different genres and activities. It was, on the one hand, a radio. On the other hand, it was more like a party. Actually, it wasn't being broadcasted, this one in particular, but I found interesting that they still called it radio. And I became particularly interested in the social role of it, of how the radio could be an event, how it could be an occasion for bringing people together. And that's, I guess, what was most interesting for me, coming from this background of performance as well, seeing that the radio could become a place for performance, for collective joy, for reproducing collective identity. All of these affordances that radio give, I guess, is what made it particularly interesting for me, coming from that background.
A question from Joe. For the literature on community radio, where did you start with doing your literature review?
Oh, that was, yeah, I guess it wasn't that systematic. I started with Argentinian literature. I was looking for work on, and perhaps you can help me with this, on this concept of open radio, and I couldn't find it. And I was like, well, maybe it's because it's a literal translation. Maybe in English it exists with different name, because in Spanish it would be Radio Abierta. And the only thing I found was a book, one book, in Spanish by an Argentinian researcher that did like a long-term project on this. So I started there. And then I went on to look at different examples. Like in the lit review, I brought together literature from different cases, like some looking at India, some looking at Ireland, for instance, some at Peru, because I wanted to focus on the Latin American history of community radio, but also kind of bring out this social aspect of community radio in general. And I guess that's what we do usually, trying to, you know, talk about a particular context, but also apply it to other cases. And the idea is that this paper is not just useful to Latin Americanists, but that it can be useful to people researching other contexts.
Well, I was going to ask you about that later, but that's quite a good place to start, is because Latin American community radio is a very political thing, actually, isn't it? Especially compared to the UK and maybe some other cultures in community radio. And it's also, you know, it's kind of where community radio started with activism. So it's rooted in activism. Have you any experience of other community radio cultures to compare with the Argentinian?
Not really. Not really. I know there's actually a friend of mine is doing some really interesting research right now on podcasts in the UK that are related to activism and how podcasts are kind of bringing together communities to put forward alternative narratives on race. This is a particular thing she's looking at. And that made me think a lot about the parallels of broadcasting in a way, or radio or media production as a tool for activism. But I haven't actually looked at community radio in the UK, for instance. I'm aware of some projects like pirate radios and things like that that are a bit, have quite a long history now, but I haven't looked into.
Okay, thank you. There's also some questions that have been sent in by people before this event. So you talk about community radio and community media as acting as spaces for members, as a space for care, for example. Do you mean that in a purely physical way or in other ways too?
I guess I mean it in a multi-layered way. And something that, again, I think is quite interesting to talk about in the midst of this crisis is how radios for many people were a site of contention of, in terms of mental well-being. People that perhaps didn't have another place to go to when they needed support were very active in the radio, for instance, like older citizens. And this was evident in the case of Eurotem, which was the community radio in the permaculture village. And I think right now that's a really important point. There's a lot of people that have been isolated due to the crisis and are lacking those kinds of contention. And artists themselves are facing that. This comes about from talking to other people in Argentina and doing some research right now on cultural policy responses and care as a policy, and whether cultural policy can be an act of care or not. And one thing that artists and curators have mentioned was this lack of care in terms of mental health and well-being. And I think these radios acted as a space of professionalization, of protection in terms of alarming people of threat, but also as a place where people could speak their truth, where people could be heard, and that adds to well-being as well.
Yeah, thank you. Also, you mentioned, well, talking of mental health, you mentioned examples of burnout when the volunteers had to take a step back. How much of a problem do you think this is in both community radio, community media, and in eco-activism more generally?
I think it's a really big problem. I've experienced burnout myself from activism. And I think this can be also a problematic thing when in cultures, let me see how I can phrase this. So I think it is definitely a problem, especially when there is a lack of resources. A lot of these radios, all of these radios count on volunteer work, obviously. So it's something that people do in addition to their caring responsibilities at home, in addition to their work. In this case, it's not only a community radio, but it's also a community radio that is embedded within a social movement, a struggle, an active struggle that is actually at the front line. So it's not even we are radio that is looking at environmental issues. Like there are other radios that are perhaps based in urban centers and that are not as, they're looking at political issues, but are not on the front lines. In this case, we are looking at radios that are on the front lines. So obviously the kind of weight that this has on people is much bigger than if they were at a distance. I thought we lost Jerry. So I think that burnout is a real problem. And also thinking about this, there is a wider issue of a culture that is, or country that is, or region that is used to things being done without resources. Because there are no resources, and there's a difference, for instance, in the UK, in the arts, for example. Independent arts still is used to getting support from the state. There's arts council grants, there are different ways of accessing support for projects. And the arts is a very precarious sector, but still people have, because of the abundance of resources, are more used to expecting remuneration and economic support for the projects they're putting forward, even if precarious. In Argentina, there is a kind of acceptance that there's no resources. So you're departing from a position in which the effort is extra. And then whenever there is an added element to add to that strain, then burnout is easier to happen, if that makes sense. I hope I phrased that in a way that made sense.
Next question. Have you come across Making Waves, Stories of Participatory Communication for Social Change, a report to the Rockefeller Foundation by Alfonso Gumicio Dagron, forward by Denise Gray Felder, and it covers 50 South American community media stories?
I know that I come across Making Waves, but I haven't read that report. I mean, that sounds like, yeah, like a title that's very iconic, but no, it sounds like something I should read. So yeah, thanks very much for that.
Okay, well, maybe, yeah, something you could follow up. Another question. So the demographic makeup of the stations, I know it was kind of hinted at a little bit in there, but I was quite interested in this because I'm interested in this in the UK. Mm-hmm. You know, you're talking about feminism in or ecofeminism within these stations, but what, broadly speaking, in your experience in these stations that you went to, is it a male-dominated kind of culture, or are women well represented in community radio in Argentina?
So as far as the kind of the cases that I looked at, because I can't claim to have done a kind of, you know, overview of the whole country, they were not male-dominated. There were a lot of women taking leading roles in several of the radios. But at the same time, in two of the radios in the mining areas, they had reported issues of sexism and internal problems because of this. So, you know, it is a country that right now is undergoing a feminist revolution. And that is also one of the reasons I decided to go for ecofeminism in this paper, and in general in some of the work I'm doing, is that right now feminism and anti-extractivism or environmentalism, if you want to frame it like that, are two of the movements that are gaining most traction. But that doesn't mean that certain attitudes are still not ingrained in the society. So these conflicts still arise. Women have a history of leading environmental and social struggles in Argentina. In terms of social, the most kind of known are the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo that led the fight for justice during the dictatorship, the last civic military dictatorship, sorry, during which 30,000 people were disappeared. But then there were other women leading environmental movements. So there is that kind of background to it already. But also a point I made in the paper was that I think it is important to analyze the gender dynamics, which I didn't have, you know, space to do in this particular paper. But I think it's also important to make this claim that ecofeminism is not something that only concerns women, but that it's something actually that could lead the way. It's an attitude, it's an ethos, it's a theory, it's a paradigm that could help all of us approach the situation we find ourselves in at the moment, which is an ecological crisis and the rise of fascism. I think that an intersectional, obviously intersectional ecofeminist perspective can help us address a lot of the different challenges we're facing right now.
So one of the things that came up in the discussion that we had when we read the paper as a group was whether you were coming to this as a point of recognizing ecofeminism as a thing that existed already in the community radio stations, or whether you were advocating that as a kind of way of setting up, or a way of putting together a culture at community radio stations in order to best tackle activism.
Yeah, thanks. So I think there is already an ecofeminist presence there. There is at least kind of emergence of that kind of ethic, and you can see more and more present in when you look at the Argentinian context, in academic debates, in debates organized by community organizations, in articles shared by this like network of alternative media that some of these radios were part of. So it is a concept and a position that is becoming really, really widespread. So I think these notions are already there. Now, whether these people that participate in the project identify as ecofeminists, I don't think most of them do. I think it's more, actually I struggled with this myself when I was writing the paper, because I was like, is this a theoretical piece, or is this something that's, you know, emerging from the data? And I usually work quite closely with data. I do what could be called grounded theory. And in this case, I was just, not to be too esoteric, but the paper kind of like wrote itself, and I couldn't place it as one kind of theory project or empirical project. It was like, I think it's useful to look at these projects from this perspective. It was more of an experiment in what happens if we look at radio from this perspective. What can we gain from starting to think about media and art in environmental conflicts from the perspective of care, particularly ecofeminist ethic of care. So it was perhaps like a provocation in a sense.
Okay, thank you. So Kim says, during our discussion, Joe mentioned the work of community radio from an affect theory perspective and the emotional labor involved. And Paula, what are your thoughts on that connection?
Connection between radio and affect?
Affect theory perspective, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess it would fit perfectly with the kind of argument I'm making. I think radio as an activity can produce and reproduce affect in many ways. So it's the content, it's also the processes, it's also the relations that are created between people. And I think particularly in the context of social movement, where you know, social movements generate different emotions, and also because of emotions and because of affect, people sustain their place in the struggle. And I think radios fulfill that task of sustaining the struggle. In a way, people become attached to the radio. They find a sense of purpose in contributing to it, and also in the relations they have. And at the same time, as we mentioned before, when there are conflicts, personal conflicts in the radio, that can lead to the attachment to distancing. So.
I wanted to ask a bit about the kind of research methodology, and it's obviously something you can't talk too much about in a paper, but I think it probably was a fascinating experience, wasn't it? Just going around, was it 15 community radio stations in Argentina?
Oh no, 15 interviews only, but okay. The radios. So I went in person to 2 of the places that I'm talking about.
Right.
And then 2 others I did long distance interviews. Within Argentina, within this research project, I went to 4 different provinces in the country. No, sorry, but if you add the capital city and the province of Buenos Aires, and it'd be 6, which were chosen because they were characteristic of the different kinds of extractive activities that take place in the country. So open pit mining, fracking, and agriculture. This kind of monocrop, large scale agriculture. And then I spent quite a bit of time in the city of Buenos Aires, because that's where a lot of things are concentrated in terms of activists and artists and exhibitions. Well, with this project, the initial idea was not to focus on one place. So it wasn't traditional ethnography in the sense of spending a lot of time in one place, but it's rather to get an overview of what are the different actors in the conflict, what are the different narratives that are emerging, and what kinds of artistic practices and alternative media practices are going on. So that's why the first project, because now I'm continuing the research, the project was called Mapping Creative Resistance. It was more about mapping and locating rather than focusing in depth in one case. And on the one hand, that was good because it did give me this overview, and now working on a book that looks at creative resistance to extractivism and trying to theorize the particular mechanisms through which artists and media practitioners resist extractivism, kind of looking at theories of art and social movements, but situating them within the Latin American context specifically and extractivism specifically. But on the other hand, it also meant that I didn't have, that much in-depth data about any one particular case. So in this case, I complemented the research visits with phone interviews. and Skype interviews and analysis of kind of, Facebook data and things like that.
So why did it's 15 interviews coded and analyzed using inductive latent thematic analysis. Why did you choose that particular way of interpreting the data?
Because I was looking for different things. I was looking for narratives. I'm still really interested in the issue of narratives, even though that doesn't show up this much on this paper. So that's why the analysis of all of the interviews was kind of conducted in this way. And then there was a bit of coding. Then I went back on that. Then what did I say? Yeah, and I guess I was interested in, I didn't ask specifically about care when I interviewed people. So when I was analyzing the interviews, I was looking for indications of acts of care, things that could be understood as care. And then he proposes 4 ways in which care manifested. So yeah, it was, again, returning to the question you asked about whether ecofeminism is something I identified or something that I'm trying to propose as a frame. I think it was more a sense of, yeah, trying to figure out what care can look like and what acts of care that perhaps are not even deliberate are taking place, especially when care hasn't been that theorized in this discipline. And perhaps it's an opportunity to rethink some things.
I think what's interesting is that these 4 ways in which care is happening, I think it transposes to, at least my experience in the UK in community radio, all of these 4 ways. And it's not, community radio here is set up for social gain, but it's not particularly set up to care or for spaces of care, if you like, but it's still happening. Well, a related question, do you have any plans to kind of continue work in community radio, either in Latin America or here?
I am interested in it, yeah. One of the ways in which I might continue to look at it is, so right now I'm doing this project that I mentioned on cultural policy responses to COVID in Argentina, and looking at cultural policy, how cultural policy can act as care or not. And I'm co-authoring this paper with a colleague in Argentina, and one of the cases that we're looking at is a program called Puntos de Cultura, or Points of Culture, which is one of the largest programs from the National Ministry of Culture. And it's a program that started in 2011, and it adapted a format from Brazil, from this notion of cultura viva, which is kind of a notion of culture as community culture as social good, and also kind of parallel to ideas of cultural democracy. And this is an idea that's kind of built from the grassroots, but that has now been institutionalized by governments, and they create these programs for funding community projects. And the program operates using an understanding of culture that's quite, we could say, anthropological, and that includes many different kinds of activities beyond the arts. So it includes communication, for instance. It includes radios. It includes also like small entrepreneurial projects, environmental projects. And right now, that program has been chosen as one of the ways to respond to the crisis by increasing the budget. And I'm quite interested in how that's happening and what that means in terms of what kinds of culture the government is prioritizing over others. And in part it is because of the recognition of community culture as an agent of social good. So I am interested in continuing looking at that project long term, right now, especially because of the COVID situation, but also long term. And within that, there is a branch of communication. So I'd be interested in looking at that as well.
In your, I know this is a difficult question, but in your opinion, how are they doing? You know, if there is activism at these stations, eco-activism, is it having an impact? Is it managing to stop fracking, or, you know, halt the kind of exploitative commercial things that are happening in Argentina?
Well, I think for me, when we look at social movements and the different kinds of strategies they have, I think it's often for a matter of morale as well, not to kind of try to judge things as successful or unsuccessful, but rather to consider them within an ecology of tactics. So for these groups, for instance, they combined the radio with other things, and a lot of them went through legal channels, trying to impose, for instance, bans of on fracking, trying to get moratoriums or something like that. The case of Andalgalá, they even went up to the court of, the National Court of Justice, the Supreme Court, in order to try to ban fracking. So they use all of the tools that they have available. They use protests as well. They try to go on the mainstream media, but often they are completely ignored. So that's why they use their own channels. They use art as well as radio. They do protests. Sometimes they do, for instance, camping outside of the Ministry of, whatever, it could be the Ministry of Energy and Mining, or it could be outside the Ministry of Justice, depending on the case. So they use different tactics. And then when things move forward, I think it is more useful to think that the different tactics contributed to an advancement in the conflict, rather than saying it was just the judicial channel or it was just the media exposure or whatever.
Thank you. Yeah. I just wanted to know if you could talk a bit more about these 4 kinds of care as well, because this is kind of almost your conclusion at the end, isn't it? The 4 different types of way that community radio stations are offering spaces of care and the care that they offer.
Yeah, sure. So actually, I was looking at the article again today, and I was thinking, well, these are not really 4 forms of care. They're actually 4 ways in which it is enacted. Like, I think the kind of, in terms of categorizing, it wasn't a very perhaps systematic way of looking at it. But I mean, you got what I meant to say with it. So in the end, it kind of works out in a way. So yeah, the first one was protection. And this was in reference to the imminent threat. And that's why it does make a difference that we are talking about community radio stations that are at the front lines and not community radio stations that are perhaps far away, but that are talking about these issues. That makes a real difference, because it is about, the police are literally coming right now and they're going to start repressing people, or there has just been a spill of cyanide water outside of your house. So it's that protection of, keeping people safe from harm that is imminent. And in that sense, it's the physical protection or care that you mentioned earlier. The second one is, well, I'm going to switch them, because actually, as it often happens when I reread, I guess it happens to all of us, we go back to something we wrote and then, oh, I want to change it. So I would have put as a second one, community support, instead of putting personal transformation. So community support, by this I meant the more kind of the mental health, the well-being, the social bond, the identity. So all of these things that are supporting people on a collective dimension. So it's not the one-to-one, but actually the process is where communities come together, and the radio offers a space for this kind of collective transformation or sustaining of the collective identity, which is a really important thing in social movement. The collective, kind of the momentum of the struggle as well. So sustaining that, staying in the community. Then the third one I would say is the facilitation of personal transformation. And that's where there's a lot of parallels with perhaps community radios in other places. People have a space for expressing their personal opinion. They have a space for upskilling, for learning new things. At the end of the day, for transforming themselves. And finally would be the networks. And in this sense, the networks are important in a country that's so big, where things are so far apart. And these radios, we're talking distances as if it was one European country to another. And yet they're all brought together by these networks of support that provide different kinds of support. So from legal issues, explaining to them how to navigate the legal aspects of starting a radio, to material support, redistributing resources, donating used equipment, and also uplifting each other's works, because through the radios they have schemes for instance, the Red Nacional de Medios Alternativos, they kind of have a system in which they play each other's work, so you can access kind of different radios shows. So yeah, that would be the 4 ways. And I think they complement each other nicely because they speak to different aspects of what care is and what care can be. And something that perhaps, I mean, well, you cannot do everything you want to do in 9,000 words, but something that perhaps would have been interesting is to engage more directly with the idea of care, with theory on care, like John Tronto or authors like that, directly to kind of see how these forms of care reflect or not different types of care that some theories of care have put forward.
It's interesting to me how there's kind of the care, and you know, it almost represents the broadcasting thing where there's the care of the listeners, you know, the presenters to the listeners, and there's also like the care between the kind of family atmosphere of the people that are on the radio station and the staff at the radio station, and that kind of micro macro thing. Is there a very kind of community, like you said, they kind of share each other's content, but the community radio in Argentina, is it well networked? Do people support each other, or is it fragmented? And I don't, you know, do they look after each other as a group, if you like?
Well, there is a lot of support. Like everyone that interviewed mentioned the importance of these networks, but there is also some fragmentation. So, for instance, there are 2 networks that I mentioned, which are Farco and Red Nacional de Medios Alternativos. Farco is specifically about radio, and the other one is alternative media. And from one of the interviews, there was this feeling that the Red Nacional had a different kind of ethos. So, you know, at one point in the article, I addressed this distinction between alternative media and popular media. And the alternative seems to be more concerned with the content, and it's all about like the content showing a counter-hegemonic position. Whereas the other one, Farco, seems to be a bit more aligned with a popular ethos. That it's not just about content, but it's also about process and about that situatedness of being, you know, grassroots and being for the people and from the people. And obviously this kind of, sometimes I didn't go in depth into these issues because I didn't feel like I had enough data to actually, you know, represent this perceived conflict properly. But these categories are contentious, and there is that fight over like, well, you're alternative, but you're not really alternative. So yeah, there are fragmentations.
Okay, thank you. So from Kim, from our previous discussion, can you elaborate on the demographic makeup of the community radio stations? Are the women interviewed representative of the communities? And Joe adds to that. And is there a class, age, or stage of life correlation too?
Okay, so yeah, when I did the interviews, and this is true for the whole research I did, I didn't collect much demographic data on movements and things like that. There are many reasons for that. But in this case, I can say from the visits I did and the people I spoke to, that something that for me caught my attention was that in the radio in Mendalgalan, a lot of the participants, the majority of the participants in the assembly and in the radio were teachers. And I mentioned this in the article. I don't go into detail. I don't go in detail into that. But I think it's an important thing to mention when we're talking about care, because teachers already had this kind of predisposition to care, especially public school teachers, which in Argentina, public school teachers have been on strike since I have, use of memory, basically. And they have always been undervalued. I mean, I know it's the same in many places, but in Argentina, it's been always an issue for strikes, always an issue that has been neglected by different kinds of governments, from across the political spectrum. And the fact that teachers are the ones leading this struggle and leading on the radio, I think is quite a significant thing, because it also talks about that vocation of care and that role of the teacher's care. Another interesting thing for the Andalgalá radio is that a lot of the people participated at kind of middle age. So it's not, activism, and this applies to the protests as well. Activism is not reserved to young people, but it's actually something that happens across generations. And I was told this story about, I was actually in the family house when they told me the story about this big protest they had, And this young man was arrested, and then when he got into the police car, he found his grandpa there, and they were all taken as a family to the prison. So that was interesting as well. And then in Neuquén, it's also, yeah, it's quite mixed, but in that case, it was young people mostly leading. And young people, I mean 30s, and they were trying to engage with different sectors of the community in different ways. So for instance, they use the arts to try to engage the young children and the young adults, and then they use perhaps the community, the open radios to try to engage the middle-aged and the elders. So there were different tactics being used. And then in terms, for instance, of race and ethnicity, which again, I couldn't go into in this paper because 9,000 words. So in Neuquén, for instance, where there's fracking, it's an area where the indigenous Mapuche people are. And this is an area where there's been oil extraction for a while, for decades, but now they brought in fracking a few years ago, and basically territorial conflicts have exacerbated because people are being pushed out of their ancestral lands, and also because fracking is creating more pollution and advancing into new areas. And at the same time, there's been in the last few decades a resurgence of the indigenous identity that had been lost before because of persecution, because of discrimination. And a lot of towns here are kind of identifying with their indigenous heritage. So there are some indigenous communities that are formally recognized as indigenous communities, and sometimes living in ancestral lands, sometimes fighting to recuperate ancestral lands. And there are others that perhaps are not living as communities, but they are recognizing their indigenous heritage. So the fight against fracking is also given from within that position. In the case of Andalgalá, it's interesting, it's different. Andalgalá is, the mining town, is in the northwest of the country, and there are other indigenous communities in the area. The town where I was, it was mostly settler, but there were interesting positions being shared about their connection to the earth and their connection to indigeneity. For instance, some white people claiming to identify as indigenous because they share the same cosmovision of indigenous populations very nearby. There are other towns that are indigenous nearby that are also facing mining issues, which is quite a kind of complicated thing to say and to respond to in that context. But there are, the racial dynamics and ethnic dynamics in Argentina vary according to the region, are very different to the UK. And definitely it's something that I'm looking at now that I'm writing a book and that I have more space to go into it. But I haven't been able to address in the article.
Is there indigenous community radio in Argentina?
Yes, so there are quite a few. And actually, thanks to that, thanks to different state programs, for instance, the law for media that was sanctioned in 2009, and also this program, Puntos de Cultura, that I mentioned before, that is funding community arts projects and communication projects. So those projects have contemplated giving more space and promoting indigenous radios. So there are indigenous radios specifically. And in addition to those are kind of more, so there are some that are like radios, and then there's also some parallel projects. I wrote something else about this, that are more like independent indigenous media outputs. So they mix radio, TV, filmmaking, writing. So yeah, there's quite a bit of that.
And are there any, maybe you don't know this, it's a bit mean question, but are there any indigenous radio stations you know of that are doing eco-activism?
In Argentina or elsewhere?
Yeah, in Argentina, yeah.
So not in addition to the ones that I've spoken to. There, I know there are, because the thing is also that a lot of the time, eco-activism perhaps is, a lot of indigenous communities across the country are kind of facing territorial conflicts because of the advance of the extractive frontier, and their lands are in danger, and also their rights are not being respected, and their sources of income are being lost because of, for instance, deforestation for growing cattle or for monocrop agriculture. So sometimes they might not kind of identify themselves as eco-activists or describe the struggle as an environmental struggle, but at the end of the day, a lot of the conflicts they're facing when it comes to territory and subsistence, it's all part of the same kind of extractive model.
And the community radio stations that you talk to, are they representative in terms of activism of community radio in Argentina as a whole, or is it that's just a certain sort of percentage of community radio that tackles that? And you know, is Argentinian community radio very political? So I'm asking, I guess.
So it is political. It is political, and I guess also going back to the question you asked before about fractures. I guess some fractures also have to do with whether some radios perhaps, and the same again with the Puntos de Cultura program that I was referencing. A lot of community culture has been really empowered and helped by the progressive governments that we had since 2000 to 2015, and now back again. These governments have really uplifted grassroots culture, but also in a way that can be read as instrumentalizing grassroots culture and communication in order to create a certain cohesion. Some then strands of community media really follow these governments and others don't. Others follow perhaps a more leftist or even anarchist tendency, while some follow this center-left progressive project. And these kinds of divisions are always present in all the kinds of political activities, be that radio, be that activism, be that art. And they also change whenever the change in government happens. So something that was interesting was that while the progressive governments were in place, critiques to extractivism were very few, because supporters of this government wouldn't dare criticize it in open. They identified the problems already. They were aware that, you know, there were these issues with fracking, with mining, but they were like, well, you know, this is a project, this is a way to eliminate poverty, this is a way to redistribute resources and help people, so we have to kind of abide with it. And then when there was a change in government to a more like market-oriented government in 2015 to 2019, suddenly those critiques could come out in the air, because now it was, you know, the opposition was doing all the extractive stuff. And in a way, it's like, come on, really? Only now you're speaking? But on the other hand, at least it happened, and there was a unity in the left that was really necessary, and that helped things move forward a lot. And that was reflected across all spaces, so, you know, from radio to activism on the street.
You talked a little bit about what, you know, how this is a part of a wider research that you're doing. Would you like to talk a bit about what your current and your future research is?
Sure. I spoke so much and so fast. I hope I wasn't speaking too fast to follow. So yeah, I'm currently writing up a book based on that, on these 2 years of research, which actually I keep putting more stuff because things keep happening. This book is looking, again, taking that bird's eye view, looking at the whole country, looking at different kinds of practices, different kinds of actors and narratives, and trying to understand, well, first of all, providing a kind of overview and documenting what is happening right now, this moment in history, this moment in creative resistance. And on the other hand, it's trying to come up with a proposal on how the arts specifically, and community media to a lesser extent, what role they serve in the resistance and in the proposal for new paradigms and new ways of being. So looking at past theories on arts, social movements, and trying to propose a series of mechanisms that and then in terms of future research, what I would like to do is also look a bit more at cultural production and media, and how they actually contribute to sustaining the hegemony of extractivism. So this would be looking at things in terms of material connections, but also the production of meaning, and looking how political actors, economic actors are related, and because we know they are related. We know that the owners of the media are also the owners of the big kind of the vast territories, and those who invest in agribusiness and all that. And the kinds of narratives that are reproduced through the media, both through newspaper platforms and also through things like soap operas, arts exhibitions, etc. So yeah, I'm interested in looking at that as well. So not just the resistance, but also the hegemony.
Just to make it very topical, how's COVID in Argentina? How are they coping, and specifically community media and community radio?
Yeah, so actually the national government was quite quick in responding. We had the record of the longest, I'm in London right now, so the government had the longest quarantine, apparently over 100 days of like really strict quarantine. And this is in Buenos Aires specifically, because some other parts of the country, they're doing okay, they have reopened. But apparently in Buenos Aires, it's, at the beginning it was okay because it was strict quarantine, but there are some structural problems that have meant, have constituted real big challenges. For instance, lack of running water in parts of the city, in informal settlements that are not really well suited for isolation. Latin America has a large informal economy, and suddenly all of these people that depend on a daily, day-to-day work to survive did not have access to an income. They implemented a series of subsidies, but there were also problems, for instance, with people who don't have a bank account. How do they collect the subsidy? So at the beginning, it was quite difficult, and a lot of people were left in a really bad situation. Now that kind of the access to subsidies has normalized a bit, but again, it's a country that has very limited resources compared to somewhere like the UK. They have, with this program of points of culture that I was mentioning, they tripled the budget. Again, it's quite minimal. Artists I spoke to said that they thought the measures were good, but they were not nearly enough to cover what they needed. There was some sort of universal credit system, and then the Ministry of Culture has worked to kind of complement the subsidies given by the kind of universal subsidies. So for instance, there were some musicians and cultural workers that couldn't access the general subsidy, which was an ingreso familiar, so a family subsidy. So then the Ministry of Culture designed a particular subsidy for freelance musicians that could not access the other one. So in these ways, they're trying to figure out responses in order to cover everyone. I haven't spoken to anyone working in community media yet about how it has affected them, only people working in theater and community theater. But I know that one of the main objectives of this Puntos de Cultura program is to provide, so they're following with their usual routes for applications, but they're focusing on two things. One is, three things. One is projects that are providing care to people on the ground right now. So they're encouraging arts organizations and media organizations to rework their programs so that they can provide assistance to their communities right now in terms of COVID. So it can be providing food, it can be making face masks, providing testing, anything like that. So cultural sites and venues have been turned into hubs of care, basically. Another way is providing assistance for people to transform their projects into digital outputs. So this is being rolled out across different art forms. And the other one is for planning projects for post-COVID. So already planning things for when places can open up. But obviously a lot of these community centers are very small and will be facing a lot of problems for trying to resume normal activities. So we'll see how that turns out.
Thank you very much. Well, we're coming up to an hour now, so unless anybody wants to frantically wave a hand at me and ask a question, I'll say thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Paula Serafini, and talking about your paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really, well, I felt like I was in Viva. So many questions, but no, thank you so much for engaging to that level of detail with my paper. It's really a privilege. So it's much appreciated, and I hope to join you for one of your next sessions.
That'd be great. I hope it wasn't too stressful for you.
No, it was great. It's just, for me, it was like, radio scholars, they know so much that I don't know, but it's always nice to have a challenge and to, you make me think about my work in other ways as well. So really, really productive.